In the annals of warfare, there are countless tales of brutality, suffering, and the dehumanization of the enemy. Soldiers are conditioned to expect the worst, to anticipate humiliation, starvation, and even a torturous death should they fall into enemy hands. For the Japanese soldiers fighting in the unforgiving Pacific Theater during World War II, this grim expectation was not just a fear, but a core tenet of their indoctrination. They were told by their commanders that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, an act so profoundly shameful it was preferable to fight to the last breath. And should they somehow survive capture, the Americans, those supposedly merciless barbarians, would surely deliver a fate worse than death. Imagine, then, the profound, mind-bending disorientation that awaited these men when they finally stepped onto American soil. Their transport ships had carried them across the vast expanse of the ocean, a journey filled with gnawing dread and the certain belief that the small, comforting routines of normal life were now irrevocably lost to them. But what they encountered, from the very first moment, began to chip away at every terrifying narrative they had been fed. They had steeled themselves for beatings, for public degradation, for the stripping away of every last vestige of dignity. Instead, they were processed, like soldiers, not cattle, not criminals, but individuals with names and histories, logged with paperwork, their identities meticulously recorded. They were marched in orderly lines, not toward dank dungeons, but toward sprawling compounds that, to their bewildered eyes, looked less like prisons and more like military training posts. The stark, high fences and the glint of barbed wire were undeniable, a constant reminder of their captivity. Yet, within those confines, an unexpected, almost surreal reality began to unfold. The arrival process was a kaleidoscope of contradictions that shattered their preconceived notions. The guards, with their stern faces and rifles held ready, maintained an undeniable authority. There was no casual cruelty, no wild sadism, but a disciplined, almost detached professionalism. This absence of anticipated harshness was itself a shock. Then came the food. Actual warm meals. Not scraps, not gruel, but rations that sometimes included bread with butter, hot coffee, and even meat. To minds conditioned by propaganda that enemies starved their foes into submission, this simple act of sustenance was revolutionary, almost an act of defiance against their own deeply ingrained beliefs. It was the U.S. Army, operating under the strictures of the Geneva Convention, which mandated humane treatment for prisoners of war. But beyond legal compliance, American officers possessed a shrewd understanding of its propaganda value. Treating captives decently wasn't just about adhering to rules. It was a strategic projection of power, a demonstration of moral superiority that aimed to subtly undermine the enemy's narrative. For these Japanese POWs, this was not merely the beginning of their captivity, but the commencement of an entirely unexpected, deeply unsettling experience. The camps themselves continued this campaign of quiet subversion. Beyond the obvious high fences and barbed wire, the interiors were laid out with an unsettling order. Rows of wooden barracks, designated recreation areas, bustling kitchens, and even spaces for work and study. Some facilities boasted libraries, stocked not just with English books and magazines, but with a range of materials that suggested intellectual engagement. Others featured sports fields where prisoners would later find themselves playing baseball or soccer, activities that felt impossibly alien given their recent past. for men who had just been dragged from the literal hell of island warfare, where the insidious grip of jungle diseases, the constant gnawing of hunger, and the omnipresent threat of death defined every waking moment. This transition was nothing short of surreal. They simply could not reconcile the chaotic, primal brutality of battle with the meticulous, almost bureaucratic order of these facilities. The psychological state of these newly arrived prisoners was incredibly fragile. Many were emaciated, their bodies ravaged by malaria, or still bearing the open, untreated wounds of combat. The American medical teams who examined them approached their task with clinical efficiency, noting infections, injuries, and the insidious parasites that clung to their weakened forms. The very act of being medically cared for by the enemy, by those they had been taught to despise and fear, was profoundly confusing. Some, deeply suspicious, resisted, convinced it was some elaborate trick, a prelude to torture or experimentation. Others, too weak or weary to resist, submitted in bewildered silence, marveling at the incomprehensible notion that their lives, their very physical well-being, seemed to matter at all to their captors. What truly unsettled them most was not any perceived harshness, for there was none. It was the mechanical kindness, clinical, detached, and rigorously governed by an unseen set of rules. One of the most immediate and lasting impressions they carried was the sheer, overwhelming scale of organization. American camps functioned with the precision of a finely tuned clockwork mechanism. Every single task, from the preparation of food to the systematic health checks, was managed according to rigid schedules. This unwavering, rigid structure stood in stark contrast to the desperate improvisation that had characterized their lives in Japanese garrisons. In their own military, severe shortages often forced soldiers to sew their own tattered clothes with whatever scraps they could scavenge, to cut each other's hair with dull blades, or to go for weeks, sometimes months, without the luxury of a proper wash. To the Japanese prisoners, the American system seemed utterly alien, almost decadently luxurious. The persistent, clean smell of soap lingering in the air was itself a profound, almost painful reminder of a world of comfort and civility they had long believed was irrevocably lost to the brutal ravages of war. Then there was the shock of equality. Officers and enlisted men alike were lined up, processed, and sometimes even stood side by side, stripped of the rigid social hierarchy that Japanese culture had so painstakingly drilled into them since childhood. While Americans certainly maintained their own distinct military ranks, when it came to the handling of prisoners, efficiency was clearly prioritized over ceremonial distinctions. This subtle but profound leveling of status was deeply unsettling for Japanese officers, who were utterly unaccustomed to such treatment. It suggested a fundamentally different kind of military order, one built less on unquestioning, sacred obedience and more on pragmatic procedures designed for mass management. As the days slowly bled into weeks in those initial phases of captivity, whispers began to spread through the barracks, carried on the air like improbable rumors. Some prisoners whispered that barbers would actually come to cut their hair. Others spoke of tailors who would issue them uniforms. And still others, more incredulous, claimed that laundry would be collected and returned, just as in a civilian town. At first, these stories sounded like cruel jokes, fanciful fabrications designed to mock their suffering. Yet, in the quiet recesses of every prisoner's mind, a new, unsettling awareness was slowly growing. America, their enemy, operated on a system of rules and precise operations that they simply could not yet begin to comprehend. For men who had once believed that surrender meant utter degradation, the simple, systematic act of being treated with such order and discipline was the greatest, most profound shock of all. It wasn't the absence of cruelty that confounded them. It was the presence of something entirely unexpected, a relentless, almost clinical order. In the days immediately following their arrival, the Japanese prisoners began to grasp that their captivity was governed by rituals far removed from the chaotic, desperate fight for survival that had defined their battlefield existence. One of the most startling and indeed culturally jarring discoveries came when camp officials began handing out strict hygiene instructions. Each man was not merely encouraged, but expected to bathe regularly, to shave on a predetermined schedule, and to maintain a consistently tidy appearance. For soldiers who had spent grueling months, sometimes years, slogging through disease-ridden jungles where every drop of water was precious, strictly rationed for drinking, the very idea of using it daily for washing felt like an absurd, almost insulting luxury. Yet, the guards enforced these rules with unwavering firmness, lining men up for inspection to ensure meticulous compliance. The shock went far deeper than simple physical discomfort or unfamiliarity. Japanese military culture had deeply emphasized endurance, a stoic indifference to hardship. Dirty uniforms, unwashed bodies, and even untreated wounds were often seen as badges of honor, tangible proof of toughness, resilience, and unwavering commitment to the cause. Soldiers in the imperial army had been praised, almost revered, for marching through treacherous swamps without a single complaint, for subsisting on meager, barely edible rations, and for wearing sweat-soaked, mud-caked clothing until it literally rotted off their bodies. Cleanliness, within this worldview, was not a virtue. It was perceived as a weakness, a self-indulgent distraction from the ultimate sacrifice required of a warrior. To suddenly be told, with the stern authority of their captors, that they must scrub their bodies, meticulously trim their nails, and keep their hair orderly, clashed violently with every single principle they had been taught, every value ingrained in their very being. It was an assault on their warrior identity. Showers became one of the first and most significant points of psychological and cultural adjustment. Many POW camps in America were equipped with large communal shower facilities, boasting the unimaginable luxury of hot water systems, a concept utterly unheard of in the field. Prisoners would later recount the sensation with vivid detail, the stinging rush of steaming water on skin caked with weeks, sometimes months, of grime, the sharp, almost alien scent of American soap, the unexpected, comforting feel of towels that were not mere rags, but actual woven cloth. For some, this forced cleansing was profoundly humiliating, performed as it was under the watchful, indifferent gaze of guards. But for others, perhaps a quiet, growing minority, it slowly began to be associated with an undeniable sense of relief, a gradual restoration of a basic human dignity they hadn't realized they had lost. Shaving presented another significant cultural divide. Japanese soldiers had rarely, if ever, been ordered to maintain clean-shaven faces during campaigns. Beards and stubble were allowed to grow unchecked in the humid, demanding tropics, often regarded as visible marks of ruggedness, a testament to their unwavering dedication in harsh conditions. American regulations, however, were unequivocal. POWs were mandated to maintain smooth faces. Razors were issued, sometimes safety razors that were entirely unfamiliar to the men, accompanied by detailed instructions on their proper use. This practice struck many prisoners as bizarre, even utterly unnecessary, a pointless bureaucratic imposition. Yet, they could not help but notice that guards meticulously inspected them afterward, often offering small, dispassionate words of praise for a neat appearance. Grooming, it seemed, was not merely about aesthetics. It was a fundamental form of discipline, a silent assertion of control embedded within the American military system. Uniforms, too, carried a potent symbolic message. Upon their initial arrival, many Japanese prisoners had been stripped of their tattered field gear. Their boots were falling apart, their shirts torn and disintegrating from months of relentless jungle wear. In the camps, they were issued simple but clean work clothes, typically sturdy denim or cotton garments, conspicuously marked with the letters PWWII in large, bold print. At first, this enforced uniformity felt profoundly degrading, a visual brand of their captivity, a constant, humiliating reminder of their defeat. But over time, a subtle shift occurred. Some prisoners, perhaps reluctantly, began to appreciate the simple fact that these clothes were regularly washed, mended with care, and replaced when needed. The contrast to their recent past, where soldiers often wore the same ragged, festering uniforms until they literally disintegrated into unusable scraps, was impossible to ignore. It was a tangible, undeniable difference. Camp authorities, in their clinical explanations, insisted that cleanliness was not some act of benevolent kindness, but a pragmatic necessity. Disease, they rightly understood, could spread with terrifying rapidity in crowded barracks, and American officers were determined to prevent devastating epidemics. Lice inspections were conducted regularly and thoroughly, and disinfectant powder was routinely applied to bedding and clothing. Japanese prisoners who resisted these measures were reminded, with dispassionate logic, that compliance was not about indulgence. It was about survival. Gradually, men began to comply, even if begrudgingly, realizing that these routines were not temporary impositions, but inescapable aspects of their new reality. What truly unsettled the prisoners was not merely the availability of soap, water, or razors. It was the deeply ingrained American belief that order itself fundamentally emanated from such routines. Hygiene, they slowly began to understand, was a subtle but potent weapon of control, a sophisticated way to discipline men without resorting to the brute force of a whip or the blunt end of a rifle butt. For soldiers raised on a strict ethic of hardship, even an acceptance of filth, the discovery that their captors valued tidiness as an integral component of military strength was profoundly disorienting. Cleanliness, they gradually realized, was not a sign of weakness. It was a form of power, expressed through the meticulous, unwavering application of regulation. It revealed a deeply pragmatic, almost sterile approach to managing human beings, a stark contrast to their own culture's emphasis on spiritual purity through physical austerity. By the time the prisoners had somewhat adjusted, even if begrudgingly, to the routines of regular bathing and shaving, another revelation awaited them, one that seemed even stranger, even more out of place in a prisoner-of-war camp. This was the presence of organized barber shops inside the camps. To men who had once cut each other's hair with dull bayonets or simply allowed it to grow wild and matted during extended campaigns, the idea that the enemy would assign trained barbers to meticulously maintain their appearance felt utterly unreal. like a bizarre dream sequence. Yet, in many American-run facilities, a small building or a designated section of a barrack was specifically reserved for haircuts. These makeshift barber shops were surprisingly well equipped, featuring chairs, gleaming mirrors, and even electric clippers. Their low hum and almost futuristic sound to ears accustomed to the silence of the jungle or the din of battle. The first visits to these barber shops were fraught with palpable tension. Japanese soldiers sat stiffly, their hands often clenched, their faces betraying deep uncertainty. They couldn't shake the nagging fear that the barber's sharp tools might, at any moment, be wielded as instruments of punishment or subtle humiliation. Instead, what they discovered was a procedure that was routine, almost coldly mechanical. Guards stood by, observing as barbers, sometimes American personnel, but often other POWs who had pre-war experience and were trained for the task, trimmed hair neatly and efficiently. The process was devoid of emotion, a sterile transaction of service. For men who had not seen their own reflection in a mirror since they had departed the shores of Japan, the image that stared back at them was often profoundly shocking. Faces, once caked with grime and scarred by hardship, now appeared cleansed. Hair, once wild and tangled, was shaped into uniform, neat styles. It was an image that no longer resembled the jungle-worn, emaciated fighters of the Pacific. This seemingly simple practice carried an unexpectedly deep symbolic weight. In Japanese tradition, hair often held spiritual meaning, and the disheveled appearance of a warrior could signify long struggle, spiritual suffering, or a profound commitment to a cause. Having it tamed, controlled, and shaped by enemy hands was initially perceived as a profound humiliation, a further indignity inflicted upon their defeated selves. Yet, as time wore on, a practical side began to assert itself. Many prisoners, even the most resistant, began to recognize the tangible benefits. Short hair meant fewer lice, a reduction in the incessant itching that plagued crowded barracks, and a welcome feeling of lightness in the oppressive summer heat. American authorities consistently stressed these pragmatic points, reminding the prisoners that good grooming actively reduced the risk of disease and contributed significantly to the orderly flow of camp life. The barber shops, perhaps unexpectedly, also began to evolve into informal social centers within the camps. While waiting for their turn, men would whisper in low voices, sharing rumors about the war's ambiguous progress, or simply observing others being transformed under the rhythmic snipping of scissors and the buzz of clippers. Some, in a strange twist of irony not lost on observers, even began to compete over whose haircut looked sharper, a subtle reemergence of personal pride in an environment designed to suppress it. In diaries and memoirs penned decades later by former POWs, these barber shops were often described as bizarre oases of normality, surreal pockets of routine in the middle of their enforced captivity. One particularly poignant account recalled the almost dreamlike experience of sitting in a barber's chair, the rhythmic snipping of scissors in the air, while the distant, cheerful sounds of baseball games drifted in from outside the barracks, as if life in the camp followed a strange alien rhythm, utterly detached from the brutal war raging beyond its fences. For the Americans, the barber shop served a purpose that extended far beyond mere hygiene. Military officials clearly understood that grooming was a potent tool for reinforcing discipline. A neatly shorn prisoner was, by their logic, easier to control, visually unified with the group, and inherently less likely to appear defiant or rebellious. An orderly appearance reduced the risk of internal unrest by subtly suppressing individualism and fostering a sense of collective compliance. Simultaneously, these meticulous grooming practices allowed the U.S. Army to conspicuously showcase its unwavering adherence to Geneva Convention standards, especially if ever questioned by visiting inspectors from organizations like the International Red Cross. It was a visible demonstration of their commitment to international law, a powerful counter-narrative to any accusations of inhumane treatment. There was also a peculiar, almost poetic irony in who often wielded the clippers. In some camps, Japanese prisoners who possessed pre-war experience as barbers were recruited to serve their peers. This arrangement unexpectedly created a small, self-contained economy of skill, where talented hands quietly earned a measure of respect among their fellow captives. A soldier who had once meticulously cut hair in a bustling salon in Osaka might find himself, under the watchful eyes of guards, once again practicing his trade, but now shaping the heads of fellow captives instead of neighborhood customers. Such arrangements, however minor, offered men a temporary respite, a subtle reconnection to a civilian life that felt impossibly distant, long forgotten amidst the horrors of war. What truly startled many POWs was not just the haircuts themselves, but the meticulously ordered environment surrounding them. Clean, swept floors, mirrors polished to a reflective sheen, brushes and scissors disinfected with clinical precision after each use. For men who had fought and lived in foxholes where sanitation barely existed, where disease was a constant companion, the contrast was absolutely staggering. Each visit to the barber became a stark, undeniable reminder that their captors lived by an entirely different military philosophy, one in which discipline was measured not solely by battlefield performance or stoic endurance, but by the shine of boots, the neatness of uniforms, and the meticulously ordered appearance of one's hair. It was a discipline of precision, a quiet, insistent assertion of control through pervasive order. If the barber shops had unsettled the prisoners with their quiet imposition of order, the tailoring services discovered within the American camps left them even more profoundly bewildered, stretching their comprehension of military logic to its breaking point. In their own army, uniforms were typically issued once, perhaps twice, and were then simply expected to last, through thick and thin, until they literally fell apart at the seams. Patches, if they were applied at all, were sewn crudely, using whatever scraps of fabric could be scrounged, and ragged, worn clothing was not just tolerated, but almost celebrated as a badge of hardened endurance, a visible testament to the warrior's resilience. To discover that their captors not only repaired their garments but meticulously maintained prisoner clothing seemed utterly incomprehensible. An inexplicable waste of precious resources and manpower. Yet, many U.S. facilities indeed had designated tailoring sections, staffed either by American quartermaster personnel or, more commonly, by skilled POWs who were provided with the necessary tools, sewing machines, cloth, and thread to keep all clothing in good repair. The first experience of this service often came when a guard would collect torn shirts or trousers from a prisoner, and, to their utter astonishment, return them days later, neatly mended with precise, almost invisible stitches. Some prisoners would simply stare in disbelief, turning the garments over and over in their hands, trying to reconcile this act with their understanding of the enemy. The very idea that an enemy would waste time carefully sewing a captive's clothes instead of simply letting them wear rags seemed utterly contrary to everything they had imagined, everything they had been taught about the ruthlessness of war. Over time, they slowly learned that such services were not random acts of benevolence but systematically organized. Garments were meticulously logged, repaired according to standardized procedures, and then redistributed in cycles that made camp life resemble a civilian institution, perhaps a meticulously run boarding school, rather than a brutal penal colony. This tailoring system was more than just practical. It carried a profound symbolic weight. A neat, well-maintained uniform, even one with PW emblazoned across the back, while stripping men of their former identities and rank, paradoxically offered them a strange, unsettling sense of equality. Officers who had once worn elaborate insignia and carefully tailored uniforms now found themselves clothed in the same sturdy work garments as enlisted men. This removal of rank distinction was a subtle but powerful blow to the deeply entrenched Japanese hierarchy, where uniforms and insignia had always symbolized honor, status, and an unshakable place in the social order. The Americans, however, approached clothing as a matter of function and hygiene, not as a badge of pride or a marker of social standing. For some prisoners, the tailoring shop, ironically, became an opportunity rather than a further humiliation. Men with pre-war experience in sewing, textiles, or factory work were specifically assigned to assist. They were given access to sewing machines, often powered by electricity, spools of thread neatly arranged in racks, and workbenches equipped with proper lighting. For these individuals, captivity offered an unexpected, almost ironic return to civilian trades, a mundane but comforting echo of their former lives. Memoirs from former prisoners mentioned that those chosen for tailoring duties often enjoyed slightly better conditions, warmer indoor work, occasional extra rations, and a renewed sense of purpose within the otherwise monotonous camp routines. Another striking element that defied their expectations was the systematic distribution of seasonal clothing. Unlike the thin, often rotting tropical rags Japanese soldiers had worn during their brutal island campaigns, camps situated in the American Midwest or South required significant seasonal adjustments. The provision of jackets, caps, gloves, and heavier trousers astonished men who had once suffered the agony of frostbite or intense cold in their ill-suited, lightweight gear. In some camps, Red Cross parcels supplemented these supplies, adding much-needed socks, scarves, or even extra fabric for patching and repairs. The prisoners slowly, almost painfully, began to recognize that their captors invested considerable effort not merely to keep them barely alive, but to maintain them according to standards mandated by international law. Standards that were far more rigorous than anything they had experienced in their own military. The tailoring services extended beyond simple uniforms. Curtains were sometimes sewn for barracks windows, bedding meticulously repaired, and even makeshift flags for sports events were produced within the tailoring shop. This surprising versatility demonstrated a level of resourcefulness and systemic organization that genuinely surprised prisoners accustomed to improvising with mere scraps of canvas or rope in their own military. They began to grasp that in America, order was preserved not through stoic endurance of scarcity, but by meticulously maintaining systems that actively prevented scarcity in the first place. To Japanese eyes, this entire operation appeared almost luxurious, even decadently wasteful. They simply could not fathom why enemy soldiers deserved patched clothes, or why precious time and manpower were devoted to such seemingly insignificant details. Yet, As weeks turned into months, the neat rows of mended garments stacked in storerooms slowly transformed, becoming silent but powerful symbols of the efficiency and discipline that so profoundly underpinned American military culture. What began as utter bewilderment slowly, grudgingly, transformed into a nascent respect, as prisoners realized that for their captors, tailoring was not a courtesy, not an act of kindness, but another meticulously planned expression of control, organization, and a fundamentally different approach to managing human capital. Just as the provision of tailored clothing had deeply unsettled Japanese perceptions of their enemy, the discovery of structured industrial-scale laundry services inside the American camps forced them to completely reconsider what captivity, and indeed warfare, truly meant. In their own imperial army, laundry had been at best a distant afterthought, often entirely neglected. Men would wash their uniforms in murky rivers if they were lucky enough to find one. Or, more often, they wouldn't wash them at all, allowing layers of sweat, mud, and blood to accumulate until the fabric literally disintegrated from filth and wear. On remote, isolated Pacific islands, soldiers frequently wore the same single set of clothing for months on end. The pervasive smell of mildew, rot, and unwashed bodies clinging to them, an ever-present reminder of their harsh reality. To step into a camp where clothing was systematically collected, washed, and returned with almost bureaucratic regularity was an experience utterly beyond anything they had ever expected, or even conceived possible. The process itself was a source of profound amazement. Camp authorities meticulously scheduled laundry on fixed, predetermined days. Baskets or bags, carefully marked with individual prisoner numbers, were collected, sometimes by truck, and delivered to central, large-scale laundry facilities. Inside these cavernous laundry rooms, steam-powered washing machines churned rhythmically, their powerful mechanisms filling the air with the sharp, clean scent of soap and hot water, an olfactory assault of freshness. Prisoners, entirely unused to seeing such complex machinery, stared in disbelief at the sheer speed and efficiency with which garments were cleaned in bulk. The mechanical noise, the endless sight of sheets and uniforms tumbling vigorously inside massive drums, seemed like something from another world. An industrial solution to a problem they had once solved with their bare hands in muddy streams. A testament to an unimaginable technological and logistical prowess. The availability of clean bed linens added another layer to the shock. Many Japanese soldiers had slept for years on damp, insect-infested ground, or on rough straw mats teeming with vermin. Now, at regular intervals, sheets and blankets were collected, laundered, and returned, smelling faintly of detergent. To lie on a bunk with crisp, clean sheets was, for some, the very first experience of such simple comfort since they had left their homes in Japan. Prisoners later recorded in their accounts that the sensation was so alien, so profoundly unfamiliar, that they often found it difficult to sleep at first, unnerved by the very absence of filth and vermin, a discomfort born of profound unfamiliarity with basic comfort. But what truly made the greatest impression was not just the services themselves, but the relentless, systematic discipline that underpinned these routines. Guards emphasized punctuality with unwavering strictness. Laundry had to be handed over precisely on time, folded correctly, and meticulously identified by number. Any deviation, any slight infraction, risked a delay in receiving clean garments. For the Americans, this was a straightforward extension of their military order, an expression of their systemic efficiency. For the Japanese POWs, it was a deeply impactful lesson in the power of highly organized systems over desperate improvisation. Instead of chaos and scarcity, every single detail was planned, cataloged, and executed with almost clockwork precision, a complete reversal of their own military experience. Laundry services also became unexpected workplaces for the prisoners themselves. Those assigned to these duties found themselves operating large industrial presses, using massive irons, and meticulously sorting uniforms on sprawling tables. Men who had once marched through dense, hostile jungles now spent hours folding stacks of neatly pressed uniforms, all under the watchful, indifferent gaze of supervisors. Some even admitted to taking a quiet, almost private pride in mastering these strange, powerful machines, treating them as new, albeit captive, tools of labor. Former accounts suggest that these jobs offered small but significant advantages: the protection of indoor work, shelter from harsh weather, and the occasional fleeting chance to interact with the International Red Cross inspectors who frequently visited these facilities. The Red Cross, in fact, played a crucial role in reinforcing these standards. Their detailed reports from inspections consistently noted the cleanliness of barracks, the provision of regular laundry services, and the systematic rotation of bedding. These findings were later circulated internationally, serving as irrefutable evidence that American camps meticulously adhered to the Geneva Convention, a powerful propaganda victory. Japanese prisoners, who had been taught to anticipate neglect, cruelty, or outright starvation, gradually came to the unsettling realization that the regular return of their clean clothing was not accidental. It was the deliberate outcome of a carefully designed, highly efficient system, meticulously engineered to showcase American compliance with international law and to project an image of overwhelming logistical capability. For many, the greatest shock came in the stark, undeniable comparison of these experiences to their own profound wartime hardships. The vivid image of a steaming, industrially powered laundry facility, with its rows of gleaming washing machines, clashed violently with their deeply ingrained memories of comrades frantically scratching lice from their emaciated bodies, or desperately wringing out uniforms blackened and stiff with mold and dried blood. That profound contrast etched itself deeply and indelibly into their developing perception of America, forever altering their understanding of their powerful enemy. In captivity, they had expected complete degradation. Instead, they found themselves in an environment where even the mundane act of laundry became a sophisticated tool of discipline, efficiency, and, in an unexpected twist, a strange, unsettling form of human dignity. While the presence and function of barbers, tailors, and laundry services shocked Japanese prisoners on a practical, logistical level, the deeper and more enduring consequences were profoundly psychological. Many POWs had marched into captivity with their very self-image shattered, convinced that they had brought indelible dishonor upon their families, their ancestors, and the sacred emperor by the unforgivable act of surrender. Yet, in the American camps, the steady, rhythmic cadence of enforced cleanliness and meticulous grooming slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to rebuild aspects of a personal identity they had believed were forever lost. For the first time in months, perhaps even years, they saw their faces clearly in mirrors, wore clothes without gaping holes or putrid stains, and slept in bedding that did not reek of decay, blood, or jungle rot. These seemingly small, insignificant details struck at the very core of how they perceived themselves, not as defeated, dishonored soldiers, but as human beings, deserving of basic care and a modicum of respect. For men conditioned to believe that captivity inexorably equaled utter humiliation and suffering, the relentless routine of order produced an unsettling, almost schizophrenic mixture of shame and relief. At first, some prisoners actively resisted, refusing showers, deliberately neglecting to shave, or avoiding the barber's chair entirely. Guards, operating under strict regulations, enforced compliance, often with firm but nonviolent measures. But over time, that initial resistance began to soften. Prisoners slowly started to notice a subtle but undeniable correlation. Maintaining a neat, orderly appearance actually altered how they were treated by their captors. Clean, disciplined prisoners were addressed with less hostility, with a more neutral tone, while those who stubbornly ignored the rules invariably drew sharp reprimands. In a strange, almost counterintuitive way, personal grooming became intrinsically linked to a fragile, reemergent sense of dignity. By appearing disciplined, by conforming to these alien standards, they could, perhaps, reclaim fragments of respect in the eyes of their captors. A small psychological victory against the pervasive shame of defeat. These subtle changes in individual behavior also had a profound influence on group morale within the crowded barracks. In an environment where despair, idleness, and constant uncertainty could easily fester into explosive fights and internal strife, orderliness became an unexpected, stabilizing force. Men who had once snapped at one another in frustration, driven by the pressures of filth and disease, found fewer reasons to quarrel when their living conditions demonstrably improved. The systematic absence of lice significantly reduced sickness and discomfort. Clean clothes diminished irritation and the pervasive sense of degradation. Regular haircuts lessened the spread of infection and improved overall health. Gradually, the general health of the prisoner population improved, and with it, moods slowly, almost imperceptibly, lifted. American officers understood this dynamic remarkably well. A healthier, calmer, and more orderly prisoner population meant fewer uprisings, less resistance, and, ultimately, more controllable camps. It was a pragmatic, highly effective strategy of psychological management. The contrast to Japanese military culture could not have been sharper or more profound. The Imperial Army had, for decades, emphasized stoicism, a hardened indifference to pain and discomfort. Suffering was not merely tolerated, it was glorified, deemed noble, a test of spirit. Comfort, by contrast, was perceived as a dangerous weakness, a corrupting influence. Prisoners, therefore, found themselves confronting a completely different, almost diametrically opposed philosophy of military discipline. Discipline, not through deprivation and suffering, but through regulated well-being, through meticulous care for the physical and even mental state of the individual. This stark realization fundamentally unsettled their entire worldview, challenging deeply ingrained cultural tenets. If their own revered army glorified endurance at the expense of health and basic human comfort, why then did the enemy, whom they had been taught to consider decadent and soft, achieve such effective control and apparent strength through the exact opposite means? Some prisoners, particularly the more introspective among them, began to quietly suspect that America's formidable strength lay precisely in its unique ability to balance rigid order with the systematic provision of basic human needs. There were also countless small, private moments of quiet transformation. A prisoner who had been utterly despondent, his spirit broken, might suddenly experience a flicker of regained pride when handed a stack of freshly laundered clothes, crisp and clean. Another might look at his reflection after a haircut and, for a fleeting moment, realize he appeared younger, almost like the man he had been before the crushing realities of war and captivity. Such experiences, while they certainly did not erase the bitterness of defeat or the deep-seated shame of surrender, slowly chipped away at the suffocating despair of captivity, offering tiny fragments of hope and self-worth. Later testimonies and memoirs revealed that these small, seemingly mundane acts of cleanliness and care, far from being trivial, gave men the essential psychological endurance to survive years behind barbed wire. Yet, it is crucial to acknowledge that not all prisoners accepted these routines positively or without internal conflict. Some senior officers, steeped in the strictures of Bushido, firmly believed that adapting to such comforts dulled the warrior spirit, slowly eroding the fierce mentality meticulously instilled by rigorous Japanese military training. They sternly warned their men not to become soft under the enemy's deceptive care, viewing it as a subtle form of psychological warfare designed to break their resolve. This persistent tension between old, cherished values and the stark, new realities of their American captivity profoundly defined life in the camps, creating a constant internal struggle. Still, the overwhelming, undeniable effect of these routines was clear. Enforced hygiene reshaped behavior, instilled a pervasive sense of calm, and, most importantly, offered prisoners a tangible, structured way to navigate the strange, dehumanizing limbo of captivity without completely collapsing into utter hopelessness. What had seemed at first like trivial, even absurd routines, barbers clipping hair, tailors meticulously repairing seams, laundry returning crisp, clean clothes, gradually, almost subliminally, became anchors of identity, providing a sense of normalcy in an abnormal world. The initial shock of enforced cleanliness slowly gave way to a grudging acceptance, and this acceptance, in turn, transformed into a subtle yet powerful survival tool. In the quiet, relentless order of American camps, Japanese prisoners discovered a profound, perhaps unwelcome truth: that dignity could be painstakingly reconstructed, not by glory in battle or stoic suffering, but by the smallest, most mundane rituals of daily life. Behind the seemingly mundane routines of grooming and cleanliness lay not accidental kindness, but a deliberate, deeply entrenched American philosophy about how to effectively manage thousands of enemy soldiers on their home soil. The barbers, tailors, and laundry facilities were not acts of spontaneous generosity or humanitarian impulses alone. They were carefully calculated, meticulously engineered elements of a much broader, sophisticated system, rooted firmly in U.S. military doctrine and the unwavering adherence to international law. By the time World War II erupted, the United States had thoroughly studied the harsh lessons learned from the First World War, an era when the poor and often inhumane treatment of prisoners had led to widespread unrest, rebellions, and intense international criticism, gravely damaging national prestige. Determined not to repeat these costly mistakes, American authorities meticulously crafted a comprehensive program in which discipline was not only maintained, but reinforced through a potent combination of rigid structure, clear regulation, and strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. At the very heart of this sophisticated system was the pragmatic belief that orderly, humane treatment of prisoners significantly reduced the likelihood of rebellion, escape attempts, and widespread unrest. Cleanliness, regular and sufficient meals, and professional medical care kept prisoners healthier, which in turn dramatically lowered levels of desperation, aggression, and violence within the camps. Officials repeatedly noted, with keen observation, that men who felt even a basic level of dignity and had their fundamental needs met were demonstrably easier to control and manage than those pushed to the brink of starvation, disease, or psychological collapse. In practice, therefore, barber shops, tailoring shops, and laundry services functioned as quiet, unassuming tools of pacification. Prisoners preoccupied with meticulous schedules, regular inspections, and their personal upkeep were, by design, far less likely to harbor thoughts of planning elaborate escape attempts or stirring up widespread unrest among their peers. Their energy was channeled, their minds occupied by the mundane, making them less of a security risk. Another crucial layer of reasoning behind these practices was, unequivocally, propaganda. The United States understood, with shrewd geopolitical insight, that news of prisoner treatment traveled far beyond the fences of their camps, resonating on a global stage. The International Red Cross made frequent, unannounced inspections, meticulously documenting conditions, interviewing captives, and filing detailed reports. By consistently demonstrating that Japanese POWs were kept clean, adequately clothed, well-fed, and properly cared for, the U.S. effectively countered and undermined enemy narratives of American cruelty and barbarism. It also significantly bolstered morale among its own citizens, who could proudly believe that their nation upheld lofty humanitarian standards, even during the brutal, emotionally charged environment of a global war. In this strategic sense, every neatly shaven prisoner, every meticulously folded pile of washed uniforms, and every well-maintained barracks became an integral part of a vast, global image campaign, a powerful projection of American values and capabilities. Logistics also played an absolutely central, often underappreciated role. The U.S. Army possessed massive, industrial-scale supply networks capable of feeding, clothing, and equipping millions of its own soldiers across multiple continents. Extending those already colossal systems to cover enemy captives certainly required additional resources and considerable organizational effort. But it also served as an undeniable, tangible demonstration of American industrial might and logistical prowess. The very existence of steam-powered washing machines, dedicated sewing stations, and fully equipped barber shops within POW camps showcased the extraordinary capacity of a nation that could afford to invest significantly in the upkeep of its enemies, while simultaneously sustaining gargantuan combat operations across two vast oceans. For Japanese prisoners, who had witnessed firsthand their own nation's supply chains collapse into desperate scarcity and improvisation, this sheer abundance, this effortless provision, was overwhelming proof of an almost incomprehensible American power and organizational genius. This pragmatic philosophy extended seamlessly into labor management. Clean, adequately clothed, and reasonably healthy POWs could logically be put to work. Many camps effectively employed prisoners in agricultural fields, vital lumber operations, or in the day-to-day maintenance of the camp itself. The laundry and tailoring shops, far from being mere services, themselves doubled as essential work assignments, giving men structure, purpose, and a way to occupy their days, combating the corrosive effects of idleness. This labor not only subtly aided the American war economy, but, crucially, kept prisoners occupied and engaged, preventing destructive idleness from spiraling into widespread unrest or escape attempts. Thus, what appeared to be simple, benign services were, in reality, carefully designed mechanisms to transform potential liabilities into manageable, even productive assets. Even the architectural design of the camps themselves reflected this meticulous, functional approach. Facilities were constructed with highly functional layouts that invariably included dedicated sanitation areas, specific workspaces, and designated recreation grounds. The clear separation of living, working, and cleaning zones ensured constant movement, routine, and a sense of controlled purpose. Guards enforced these physical boundaries, but the systematic efficiency of the system itself carried much of the weight of maintaining order. Prisoners, meticulously guided by schedules and routines, found little opportunity or incentive to disrupt the pervasive order. To Japanese eyes, this American philosophy remained deeply paradoxical, almost incomprehensible. They had been raised, steeped in a tradition that fiercely believed enemies sought to break prisoners, to reduce them to mere shadows of men, to strip them of all humanity. Instead, they encountered a captor who believed, with unshakable conviction, in maintaining appearance and health as sophisticated instruments of control and management. What they could not possibly know at the time was how deeply this philosophy was embedded in the very fabric of American military tradition. A powerful fusion of stark pragmatism, unwavering adherence to the rule of law, and the profound, almost spiritual belief that order, rather than cruelty or brute force, was the ultimate guarantor of victory and lasting control. When the war finally ended, and the gates of captivity slowly, ceremonially opened, Japanese prisoners carried home memories that were profoundly different from what they had imagined or been prepared for when first captured. Many wrote in their memoirs, or shared in quiet, often hesitant conversations, how profoundly the unexpected experience of barbers, tailors, and laundry services had altered their fundamental perceptions of the enemy. For men who had once pictured Americans as brutal, unfeeling conquerors, the structured, almost sterile routines of camp life revealed a nation whose formidable strength was expressed not only on the battlefield with overwhelming force, but in its meticulous ability to maintain order, discipline, and even a strange form of detached care, even for its captives. Accounts collected decades later continued to describe the astonishment, almost childlike wonder, of men seeing industrial laundry machines or professional barbers at work for the first time. Some vividly remembered the stinging sensation of soap on skin long caked with sweat and grime, while others recalled the profound shock of being issued clothing that was meticulously mended rather than simply discarded as worthless rags. These small moments, utterly insignificant to Americans who took such comforts for granted, became indelibly etched into the minds of Japanese soldiers who had endured years of unimaginable scarcity and filth. Veterans repeatedly testified that the first time they lay on truly clean sheets or wore neatly pressed uniforms in captivity was when they viscerally realized just how vast and profound the gulf was between the two militaries' approaches to human needs, even in the brutal context of war. This complex memory left a complicated, often contradictory legacy. On one hand, former POWs frequently admitted, sometimes reluctantly, that their very survival was due, in significant part, to these unexpected systems of care. Diseases that might have killed them in the unforgiving tropics were effectively curtailed by the rigorous hygiene routines. Despair, that constant companion of captivity, was eased, if only slightly, by the surprising dignity afforded by clean clothing and a semblance of order. On the other hand, they struggled profoundly with an internalized sense of shame. To accept such comforts, such meticulous care, from the enemy clashed violently with the deeply ingrained values of stoicism, self-sacrifice, and unwavering endurance drilled into them in the imperial army. Some never spoke of it openly, fearing judgment or incomprehension from family members or a society that could not fathom how captivity could have been endured with anything short of unremitting suffering and defiance. Historians meticulously studying Japanese POW accounts have noted, with significant emphasis, how frequently these seemingly minor details appear in their narratives. In oral histories, men often bypassed grand strategic maneuvers or epic battles, choosing instead to vividly describe the bewildering experience of standing in line for a barber's chair, or the profound sensation of receiving a stack of neatly folded, clean laundry. These poignant recollections became shorthand, a concise way to articulate the fundamental strangeness of their captivity, serving as powerful symbols of a world that was, against all expectations, ordered, efficient, and in its own detached way, strangely humane, all unfolding in the very middle of a global conflict otherwise defined by unspeakable brutality. The memory of these services also played a subtle but crucial role in post-war reconciliation between Japan and the United States. When exchanges and dialogue between the two nations slowly grew in the decades following the war, some former POWs privately acknowledged that their treatment in the camps had fundamentally challenged and softened the harsh, dehumanizing propaganda images of America they had once held. Cleanliness, pervasive order, and predictable routine had, perhaps ironically, softened the image of the enemy, revealing a nation whose power was deeply rooted in meticulous discipline and logistical prowess as much as in its devastating weaponry. Although bitterness certainly remained, especially over the profound shame of surrender, the recollection of these surprising, almost paradoxical camp experiences formed one of the few areas where quiet respect gradually, almost imperceptibly, began to replace ingrained hostility. Even in modern academic studies of POW life, the enduring astonishment at the provision of barbers, tailors, and laundry services is consistently cited as a profound window into deep cultural contrasts. For the Japanese, these services starkly highlighted the immense gulf between two fundamentally different worldviews, one that glorified sacrifice, stoicism, and the austere endurance of scarcity, and another that equated national strength with efficiency, meticulous organization, and a pragmatic approach to human care. In captivity, these profound lessons were not taught in classrooms or through ideological indoctrination, but viscerally experienced in the daily cycle of soap, the snipping of scissors, and the precise stitching of seams. Thus, long after their release, Japanese prisoners carried home not only the indelible scars of defeat and the painful memories of war, but also the enduring, almost haunting memory of how America's meticulous orderliness had profoundly shaped, redefined, and utterly transformed their captivity. What had once seemed utterly unimaginable, being shaved, dressed in clean clothes, and handed fresh sheets by the very enemy they were sworn to destroy, remained etched in their recollections as the most profound, the most enduring shock of all. It was a testament to the unexpected power of seemingly trivial acts to reshape perception, challenge identity, and, ultimately, to redefine the very meaning of humanity in the shadow of war.